6 months ago, Zhou Shixia became trapped inside a mysterious game where every wrong choice could cost him his life. In that world, he met Luo Zilu, a man who was both dangerous and the only person willing to protect him until the very end. In the end, Zhou Shixia escaped the game and returned to reality, but he soon discovered something that should have been impossible. Luo Zilu had followed him there. To reunite with Zhou Shixia, Luo Zilu had sacrificed everything and become a player in the game himself. And after all the pain, fear, and loss they had endured, the two of them finally found their way back to each other. But, just when everything seemed to be over, Luo Zilu began to question his own existence. If memories can be false and fate can be programmed, then is their love still real? This is not only the final chapter of Escape from the Basement, but also the final answer to one question. Can someone truly love a person who was created by a game? That night, Zhou Shixia decided to do something. Even he never expected to try and pull Luo Zilu out of the emotional darkness consuming him. For the first time, he realized that this dangerous man carried not only hatred, but also wounds that had never truly healed. Zhou Shixia tried to fulfill every request Luo Zilu made, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to see him smile just one more time. But Luo Zilu quickly noticed. He asked Zhou Shixia what he really wanted. And the answer left Luo Zilu speechless. Zhou Shixia admitted that the thing that troubled him most was seeing Luo Zilu suffer. He said that if Luo Zilu was carrying pain in his heart, he was willing to stay by his side. In that moment, for the first time, Luo Zilu did not know how to respond. But he did not know that outside that room, everything had already begun to change. A breaking news report suddenly appeared on the screen. One by one, the people connected to Luo Ziyun's tragedy were investigated and exposed. Names fell, and long-hidden secrets were dragged into the light. Luo Zilu quietly read the final message from his informant. He believed he had finally fulfilled his promise to Luo Ziyun. But instead of feeling relieved, he felt a sense of unease unlike anything he had ever experienced. Then Luo Zilu asked Zhou Shixia a question he had avoided for a very long time. If everything came to an end, would Zhou Mei leave? Zhou Shixia did not answer directly. Instead, he enthusiastically talked about Luo Ziyun's dream, a small town near the mountains and the river, where life moved slowly and peacefully. He said he wanted to see that place someday as well, and for the first time in years, Luo Zilu began to imagine a different future. But that very thought frightened him. The next day, Luo Zilu took Zhou Shixia back to the place where he and Luo Ziyun had lived as children. Inside the old house that was about to be demolished, Luo Zilu finally spoke about the guilt he had carried for so many years. He believed that his decision to leave had forced Luo Ziyun to pay the price. Then, amid the ruins of the past, he noticed a broken photo frame. Luo Zilu bent down and picked it up, reflected. In the shattered glass was Zhou Shixia's face. He looked at him for a long moment before asking a question that made everything stand still. Zhou Mei, would you like to build a new home with me? But before Zhou Shixia could answer, a terrified scream and the sound of alarms echoed throughout the building. And a familiar figure appeared within the flames. Luo Zilu thought the fire was the worst thing that could happen that night. But he was wrong. Amid the flames and the sound of alarms, he kept seeing a strange figure calling for help. A figure that should not have existed. Zhou Shixia noticed that something was wrong with Luo Zilu. But before he could ask, Luo Zilu grabbed him and ran. Because he had the unsettling feeling that something was watching them. Outside, the rain began to pour. And the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then everything spiraled out of control. A car suddenly burst out of the darkness at terrifying speed. Luo Zilu only had time to shout once. Then came the sound of a violent crash, tearing through the rain. When Zhou Shixia regained consciousness, the car had been reduced to twisted metal. In despair, he tried to help Luo Zilu stand up. But then a familiar voice called out from behind him. The person who appeared had Lu Qi's face. But Zhou Shixia quickly realized a far more terrifying truth. The person standing before him had never been Lu Qi. It was the system. And for the first time, the system no longer hid its true intentions. It admitted that it had never wanted Zhou Shixia to complete his mission. What it truly wanted was to watch humans suffer, despair, and break apart. To it, humanity's strongest emotions were nothing more than entertainment data. But there was one thing the system could never understand. No matter how many times Zhou Shixia was pushed into despair, he never completely broke, and that was causing its game to spiral out of control. The system decided it was time to correct the error. At that very moment, Luo Zilu stood up again. Even though his body was barely able to move, he still stepped in front of Zhou Shixia. He told Zhou Shixia to run and find help. But the moment Zhou Shixia turned around, an explosion echoed through the rain. Time itself seemed to stop as Luo Zilu collapsed into his arms. For the first time, Luo Zilu confessed the truth he had always hidden. He wanted Zhou Shixia to stay by his side forever. And when Zhou Shixia broke down in tears and accepted that confession, Luo Zilu simply smiled softly. before his body slowly grew cold beneath the rain. When Luo Zilu opened his eyes again, the first thing he saw was the ceiling of a hospital room, but the first person he thought of was still Zhou Shuya. He immediately asked the doctors where Zhou Shixia was, and the first answer he received made him realize that something was terribly wrong. No one in the hospital knew who Zhou Shixia was. Ignoring all warnings, Luo Zilu got out of bed and rushed out. He tried calling Zhou Shixia, but all he heard on the other end was a chilling message. This phone number does not exist. In that moment, Luo Zilu remembered all the strange things that had ever happened around Zhou Shixia. He contacted the psychiatrist they had visited together, but the woman insisted that she had never met either of them. It was as if Zhou Shixia's entire existence had been erased from this world. Then the police arrived and brought another shocking revelation. According to official records, only Luo Zilu and Lu Qi had been involved in the accident that night. There had never been a third person. Luo Zilu began to realize that the truth was more terrifying than death itself. Zhou Shixia was disappearing from everyone's memory, but there was still one person who remembered him, Lu Qi. When Lu Qi regained consciousness, the first thing he did was not ask about anyone's condition. Instead, he accused Luo Zilu of having killed Zhou Shixia in another lifetime. Luo Zilu could not understand what Lu Qi was talking about, but he immediately realized something even more important. Lu Qi still remembered Zhou Shixia, and that meant Zhou Shixia had never truly disappeared. Luo Zilu recounted every strange thing he had ever witnessed involving Zhou Shixia. The cryptic words, the desperate attempts to run away, and the constant fear of death. Gradually, an unbelievable theory began to take shape. Perhaps this world was nothing more than a game, and Zhou Shixia had never truly belonged here. Lu Qi admitted that he had returned from the past to save Zhou Shixia, but every different choice had led to a completely different ending. Suddenly, Luo Zilu remembered the last words Zhou Shixia had said to him, "When the game continues, we will meet again." For the first time, Luo Zilu accepted a cruel truth. Perhaps Zhou Shixia had returned to his own world, but somewhere else. Zhou Shixia opened his eyes and saw a message displayed on a screen. "Congratulations. You have completed the game." Zhou Shixia woke up in the real world, but the feeling of loss had not disappeared. The first thing he did was not rest. Instead, he went to the hospital to pay the medical bills for the father who had been bedridden for years. When asked why he had disappeared for so long, Zhou Shixia gave only a strange answer. He said that he had just finished playing a game. But no one understood what that game had taken away from him, because in Zhou Shixia's mind, memories of Luo Zilu continued to replay over and over. Every memory felt as though it had happened only yesterday, while the rest of the world dismissed it as nothing more than a fantasy. On his way to the hospital room, Zhou Shixia overheard people talking about him. They pitied him, a child who had grown up in violence and abandonment, yet still chose to care for the father who had hurt him. Zhou Shixia stood outside the hospital room for a long time. The man lying in that bed was the source of nearly all the suffering in his life, but he was also the only thing still connecting Zhou Shixia to reality. Lost in thought, Zhou Shixia set the bag of food down. Then he calmly asked his father whether he wanted the food braised or steamed. The only response he received was another stream of incoherent curses. And then, Zhou Shixia laughed. It was a broken smile, filled with both pain and despair. He said that he would continue being a good son, because if he stopped, he did not even know what would remain of himself. But at that very moment, a loud commotion erupted in the hallway. Someone was causing a disturbance. Zhou Shixia turned his head instinctively, and suddenly, it felt as though his entire world had stopped. The man standing at the end of the hallway was Luo Zilu. Zhou Shixia could not believe his eyes, but Luo Zilu looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. He introduced himself as the doctor responsible for treating Zhou Shixia's father. No memories, no past, no Zhou Mei. Zhou Shixia struggled to remain calm and asked for his contact information. After a brief but terrifying silence, Luo Zilu agreed. The sound of the contact scan echoed through the hallway, as though fate itself had started moving once again. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, a familiar and terrifying voice spoke. "A new main mission has been activated." That night, Zhou Shixia could not fall asleep. He opened Luo Zilu's chat window over and over again. The face was the same. The name was the same. But the memories were completely different. A frightening thought slowly began to form in his mind. If the system could send him into the game, then could it also bring someone from the game into reality? Zhou Shixia decided to take a chance. He invited Luo Zilu to have dinner with him, and to his surprise, Luo Zilu agreed immediately. That entire afternoon, Zhou Shixia spent his time choosing what to wear. It no longer felt like preparing for a simple meeting. It felt like he was about to confirm his own fate. As the clock approached 9 of the clock, Luo Zilu still had not arrived. Zhou Shixia began to think that he had been wrong, but at that exact moment, Luo Zilu walked in. He apologized for being delayed by a long surgery, and that smile only made Zhou Shuxia feel even more confused. He carefully tried to ask about Luo Zilu's past, habits, and daily life, but the more he asked, the more the answers proved that they were completely different people. Zhou Shuxia began to believe that everything was just a coincidence, until Luo Zilu invited him to come home and look over some medical documents. Zhou Shuxia hesitated, but in the end, he agreed to go with him, and the moment he stepped through the front door, it felt as though the blood in his body had frozen. This house was exactly the same as the one in the game. Every corner, every object, not a single detail was different. Zhou Shuxia did not even have time to run. The door behind him had already closed. Familiar arms wrapped around him from behind, and a voice he could never forget whispered softly in his ear, "At last, we have finally come home together, Zhou Mei." In that instant, Zhou Shuxia understood everything. Luo Zilu had never forgotten him. He had truly stepped out of the game. And to make that happen, he had paid a price beyond anyone's imagination. He had even forced the system to bring him into Zhou Shuxia's world. But the price of their reunion had already been decided. A cold metallic click echoed around Zhou Shuxia's wrist, and the system's emotionless voice announced, "Congratulations, player Luo Zilu. The confinement mission has been successfully completed." 2 years had passed since Zhou Shuxia escaped from the game. He still stood behind the cashier counter every day. Only one thing had changed. The store now belonged to him. Then one day, a new system appeared. It came with an official apology, and compensation totaling more than 2 million yuan. Zhou Shuxia was stunned. It turned out that everything that had happened had been officially classified as a system malfunction. But the price of that malfunction was that Luo Zilu had become trapped in the real world. Medical examinations showed that both of them were completely healthy. In fact, Luo Zilu was even healthier than the average person. When he learned that none of his wealth could be transferred into this world, he simply said one sentence, "Then from today onward, I will have to let you support me." Zhou Shuxia burst out laughing. And he offered Luo Zilu a job at his store. Luo Zilu agreed immediately. It seemed that life had finally returned to normal, but there was still one person who could not escape the past. Luo Zilu often sat alone on the rooftop late into the night. Zhou Shuxia knew that he was thinking about Luo Ziyin, the person who had been left behind in that other world forever. And there are some losses that can never truly be undone. Then things began to change. Luo Zilu became quieter and quieter. He left early, came home late, and always left breakfast on the table. Zhou Shuxia began to feel uneasy. He started paying attention to every small detail. The pile of dirty clothes kept growing. New scratches began appearing on the car. And Zhou Shuxia's imagination began to spiral out of control. He became convinced that Luo Zilu was hiding a terrible secret. So Zhou Shuxia decided to follow him. And then, he saw a ring box. Zhou Shuxia was completely devastated. But the truth turned out to be heartbreaking in an entirely different way. Luo Zilu had never betrayed him. He had only been rebuilding the basement from that time long ago with his own hands, because he was afraid that all of his memories, his love, and even his own existence were nothing more than lines of code created by the system. And when Zhou Shuxia smiled and said, "I accept. Keep me by your side forever," for the first time, Luo Zilu truly believed that he was real, after all the deaths, the disappearances, and the worlds that had fallen apart. Zhou Shuxia still chose to stay by Luo Zilu's side, not because he was forced to. Not because he had nowhere to run, but because, to him, the only place that truly felt like home was wherever Luo Zilu was. But what about you? Would you dare to love someone who was willing to destroy an entire world just to keep you by their side? Leave a comment below. Is Luo Zilu the definition of absolute love? Or the most dangerous obsession of all?